Hello, everyone. It is Kristi. It is Sunday, and we're going to get right into this. We're going to continue on with the evolutionary theory of patriarchy by Smuts, and just also, I should FYI you that my internet's been a little bit on the unreliable side. So if for some reason I drop out, that's not anything I'm doing wrong. At least I'm trying not to do anything wrong. It's probably just a bad connection. So yeah, we're looking at Smuts' account as to how we ended up in the social situation that we do with the social structure of patriarchy. We've gone over a lot of it, and I'm not going to go over it today. You can go back to the beginning of the last video if you want a little recap, but I think we are up to Hypothesis 3. And so I'm going to put on my desktop audio so you can hear the speechify. And we're just going to get right into it. All right. There's one other thing I do want to do. That's to make sure I've got my live stream up in case I see any problems with connections, stuff like that. All right, now, so my producer job is done, my audio tech job is done, my visual tech job is done. Now it's time for me to be the talent. Okay, let's go with Hypothesis 3.
Hypothesis 3. Over the course of human evolution, and particularly since the advent of agriculture and animal husbandry, males gained control over resources that females need to survive and reproduce. This increased male ability to control and coerce females. Because all human economies involve some form of resource sharing, we tend to take this aspect of human life for granted. However, it is important to realize that humans are unique among primates in this regard. In all other primates, once individuals are weaned, they are entirely responsible for feeding themselves and do not rely on others for resources. It is true that food sharing and especially sharing of meat occurs occasionally in chimpanzees, but individuals do not rely on sharing for more than a small fraction of their food. Thus, in all other primates, females rely on their own efforts to obtain food and do not depend on males for resources.
I'm going to pause that because that's really an insightful description. It's one of those things that, again, you think that, I'm going to turn this, it's kind of uncomfortable. You would think is sort of like a taken for granted in human societies, the way that we organize our food distribution. But this is the whole point of critical analysis, right? And the point of feminist critique, and lots of critiques, basically all, like I said, all critical analysis. Why are things the way they are? And could they have been different? Like, why do we have this particular social structure? And what are the natural consequences? What are the implications of this? What does the choosing of this particular path eliminate as other options? You know, we have a concept in political science, I'm sure it probably exists in other disciplines as well. And the phrase is called path dependency. And the idea is that once you come to a fork in the road, as it were, in terms of a decision path, and you decide on one thing, and then you make another decision that reinforces that first decision, and you build on this over time, you essentially eliminate your ability to do other things. Let me give a more practical, real-world example. When the United States decided to become, instead of the Confederacy of the Articles of Confederacy, but a federal government with states underneath it, right? Once we've decided to go with winner-take-all elections, these decisions then make it much more difficult, like especially as you go down, you establish the rules, you establish the customs, you establish, so these aren't legal things, but the expectations and the values, the practices and the norms around these particular choices. It becomes very difficult for us to go back and change to a PR system. And so this is the notion of path dependency, that in some way the path that you are currently on is a consequence of decisions taken in the past. And those past decisions constrain your ability to make decisions now. So I think, we should really reflect on the fact that when it came to, I understand that that there are biological reasons for child rearing, in that human kids are just like really needy compared to other animals. They don't walk as soon as they're born, like, horses and giraffes after a few hours after they're born. Our babies don't walk. They need a lot more care. They're not very sensible. They really need a lot of attention. You don't just expect a 2-year-old to know not to fall into a lake of water, right? However, this idea that obtaining food is suddenly culturally, not biologically, but culturally taken over by men, biological, I guess, cis men, right? Because we'll just go very basic here and not buy into the binary so much as like think about more overall categories, just, so if that's a choice. Yes, there are in some points of a woman's life where maybe agricultural work isn't ideal for her. But again, I think we tend to overestimate how much time and physical labor on the one hand, childbearing and child rearing is not considered an obstruction in the house or for certain female normed duties, gendered duties. But for other ones, they're considered, oh, you can't do that because you're a woman who has babies. So I think it's worth looking at this more reflectively and thinking about the choices that have been made in the past and how that has constrained women for thousands of years to come. So past dependency and critical feminist or feminist critical analysis. Interesting.
We know that at some point during human evolution, our ancestors shifted from an omnivorous diet based on individual foraging to a diet that included more meat, more extensive food sharing, and a sexual division of labor. It seems very likely that from the start, males did most of the hunting, as they do among chimpanzees and among human foragers today.
No. So this is something that, as research has, we looked at this more recently, the way that this myth that men were the hunters and women were the gatherers, when in fact all human beings were foraging. And yes, there might have been some particular activities that men did in groups, but this idea that there was a strict division of labor doesn't exist empirically. It doesn't exist in the facts of the world. It exists in the norms. Sorry, I'm going to have to cough here. I don't know what happened. Women were always hunting. Women have always farmed. Women have always done physical labor, whether it's picking up their kids and raising their kids or if it's hauling hay bales. Women have always worked. And that is the fact. The story is that men do the hard work and women do the easy work. And that's a lie. That's a lie designed to demean and undermine work that has been coded and gendered as female or feminine. So we have to really think about the myths that we're fed versus the empirical reality. And so, males, humans did not do most of the hunting. This is so and of course this was like 20 years before this paper came out, so fair enough. But let's correct this mistaken idea immediately.
Once a shift toward meat eating and food sharing occurred, the stage was set for increased male control over females via male control over meat.
Again, although I understand where she's going with this, I think it's more of a resource control than a meat control, because as we looked in the article, women would go out with bow and arrows and then they'd shoot rabbits. They'd fish. Hunting isn't always hunting bison or a buffalo or whatever else, right? There's a lot of small game animals that probably made up a much more reliable portion of humans' diets than the big meat things that were harder to catch, probably, almost impossible to preserve. And so, I think this empty speculation we can update with more recent facts and understanding to say this idea of hunter-gatherer is false. Where did it come from? Male scientists. I'll tell you right there. That's where the notion came from, was male scientists. And in fact, humans generally foraged for food, both in terms of hunting and agriculture.
This may not seem inevitable after all. Food sharing alone would not necessarily increase male power over females, since to the extent that males needed food gathered by females, females might have as much power as did males. However, if male control over females was already underway prior to the evolution of hunting, then the food sharing system could be incorporated into sexual politics in a way that increased male control. I suggest that male-male alliances and male control over resources interacted in a positive feedback loop over the course of human evolution. The prior existence of male cooperation for political and reproductive goals probably facilitated male cooperation in hunting and in controlling the results of the.
Again, we're getting into that two just so stories of the sexual division of labor, which I understand were available at the time, but are probably completely false when we look at actual ethnographic evidence.
Hunt. The possibility of controlling resources, in turn, probably increased the benefits to males of forming alliances with other males, so these alliances grew stronger over time.
I don't doubt the idea that men with more physical strength and also within intergroup competition and stuff, like that notion of controlling resources probably was a factor in status, in group cohesion, and whatever else. I just don't think it's quite as based in gendered labor as the narratives that we've been given.
Nevertheless, it is likely that the important female contribution to subsistence in most foraging and simple farming economies allowed females to retain some economic power and placed limits on male control over women. However, with the advent of intensive agriculture and animal husbandry, women, by and large, lost control over the fruits of their labors.
I'm just going to point out here that the sources on these are pretty dated at this point in time. She's looking at articles from 1986, 1975. And I'm sure that, like I said, with the stuff that we most recently saw, a lot of these things might be questioned with better evidence now rather than just kind of relying on a retrofitting of sexist assumptions on prior evidence, which is pretty much how science, like evolutionary theory, worked for most of its existence. There's a lot of built-in sexism because of the values of the men doing the science at the time.
Foraging and nomadic/and-bum horticulture require vast areas of land and mobile females, making it more difficult for men to control women's resource base and to restrict women's movements. However, when women's labor is restricted to a relatively small plot of land, as in intensive agriculture, or is restricted primarily to the household compound, as in animal husbandry, it is easier for men to control both the resource base upon which women depend for subsistence and women's daily movements.
Yeah, I think, Corey is in the chat and made a really good point, and that is the role of religion. So I think that, these kinds of resource debates or points are interesting and probably quite valuable. I think they tend to probably overestimate a little bit. Women were expected to work and to provide food. I don't know that there's a lot of evidence that men weren't giving women food. However, I think what is more likely, rather than this idea that women did agriculture and men brought home meat and meat made men bond, I guess, is kind of a logic going on there. I think it's a lot more, as Corey pointed out, about the social things that built up around it, right? So what we found if you look back in history in terms of the inheritance of women in a family, there are a lot of biases where women are excluded from in Western, I'm going to have to go with Western Europe, right? Because that's my history and that's what I know. So I'm going to not try to broadly generalize this to the whole globe. I'm just going to talk about like Western European history. That you do have the Salic law that says women can't inherit. And in Scotland, you had times where men claimed women couldn't inherit. But here's the thing. If a group of men think that a woman has a claim on a piece of land that will help them, they usually will back the woman in a matter of self-interest. And so you see variation. It's not so much whether or not women have power. It's more about whether or not men can benefit by having a woman inherit. Because women didn't, in most of the Western European traditions, if a woman had control, say, over her dowry, whatever else, that didn't transfer to her daughter upon her death. It went back to another male heir. So women were sort of these temporary holders of power, rather than being a consistent form of government or a consistent leader like we might have today. And so I think that it's not as simple as saying men excluded women from power. If we look historically, we've seen that men have been willing to use their relationships with women or their kinship relations with women in order to advance themselves or their kin group, mostly themselves. And so I feel like it's more of the social, as Corey points out, that The social factors rather than pure economics that were upholding oppression, because you need people to work, right? You need people to contribute. And again, saying this idea that women wouldn't go out with, and hunt with the group, or bring their own hunting objects with them to kill a rabbit or a squirrel while they were out, it just defies logic. All right, let's keep going.
Female dependence on men for resources increased their vulnerability to male domination for 3 reasons. First, as noted above, when women's work became concentrated in a small area, it became easier for men to monitor and guard their movements and activities.
I think that that's true, but I don't think you need to be women working in a concentrated area, because I think that for certain women, when you're younger and you don't have any kids, you probably have a wider scope of travel. And then when you're older and you're having children, you probably want to stay a little bit closer within the group unless someone's watching it. But it is the case that as you get a distribution of power and status and authority, you see men restricting women's, like, like, look at Saudi Arabia today, right? Like, that's not moved on from the most repressive situations we've found. So we know that doesn't have to necessarily do anything with resources. It's way more social, I think.
Second, the more resources men invest in their mates and their mates' children, the more concerned men become to ensure that the offspring in which they are investing are their own, which increases their motivation to control female sexuality.
This, we know, is absolutely true. There's always been a sexual hypocrisy within men that just look at it like an attitude of Andrew Tate. If I go out and have sex with another woman and I'm in a relationship, as long as I don't care about that woman, I'm not cheating. But if my woman looks at another man, she's cheating. That is messed up. That's the abuser mentality. And certainly we do know that those kinds of behaviors and those kinds of men and women, but we know you have a physical advantage over your partner. Using patriarchy comes from violence. So this is just establishing that fact.
Third, as women's dependence on men for resources increases, resistance to male domination becomes increasingly costly because women are unlikely to be able to acquire sufficient resources for themselves or their children without male support. Men recognize
I think this kind of, in some ways, leaves out what happens when women are widowed. And I know that this isn't really the author's intention, but there are counterfactuals out there. That I think, where women are expected to lead a household or to have more control, and maybe it's between marriages or whatever else. But I'm just kind of pointing out little gaps here. So
intimate connection between their ability to control women and female economic dependence on men. For example, in West Africa, men equate loss of economic control over women traders with loss of sexual control over women. Clark 1988:8. In addition, cross-cultural analyses generally support the hypothesis that male control of resources makes women more vulnerable to male aggression.
True.
Schlegel and Berry, for example, reported a statistically significant cross-cultural association between reduced female contribution to subsistence and increased frequency of rape. However, it is important to note that women's contribution to subsistence is unlikely to be the best measure of male control of resources, since women may work very hard but still not control the fruits of their labors.
And that's important, too, that men will steal women's labor. This is why I always have a little bit of a side eye when it comes to communism, or not communism, Marxism, because within all of these guys sitting around thinking about how they're oppressed and exploited by other men, there's such a lack of any self-awareness that they themselves are stealing the labor of women in their lives, or expecting free and unpaid labor, and they are the bourgeoisie in this situation. They're the ones who are doing the exploitation. And that lack of self-awareness just kind of reduces, I think, just generally the credibility. So until, I think, and that's what Marxist feminists have brought up, or at least, made contributions to. But anyway.
Levinson reported a more germane result. Across cultures, there is a statistically significant positive association between the degree of male control over the products of family labor and the frequency of wife beating.
These are done in 1989, and I know she's going to mention an article by Buss here pretty soon. Some of these are a little bit dated, and I think I'm not doubting I'm not doubting these at all. I just think that there might be alternative explanations that we should be looking at, or other things that we should be controlling for to better understand this phenomenon. But certainly, here's the thing: is when you give power to someone without the ability, like with no checks, and which is a lot of times, again, Western society, man is considered the king of his castle. You're going to get an abuse of power when violence is considered not only normalized but a way to make sure you keep your family in check. Violence will be used, and so like we still as a society, we do a terrible job of addressing, I think, child abuse and domestic violence, and just like in terms of setting some educational standards in schools that you don't hit people. Like, I mean, okay, I don't want to like shame kinky people here, right? So, I mean, that's consensual. But you don't use violence to harm someone in order to get your way or to punish them, right? And I think we haven't really properly addressed that, especially since violence is considered, I think, valuable as a way to establish your masculinity in those toxic male norms that we've brought with us since the days that we were like, climbing down from the trees. I'm going to wrap this one up, this last sentence, and then we're going to finish up because we've been going for 25 minutes. And I think the ad roll goes at 24 minutes. And I'm trying to get through these without ever having an ad roll. But in case I do go long, I want to make some money on the side. So let's see if we can get through this.
In societies in which men control resources, some men often have much more than others. This brings us to the fourth hypothesis for the evolution of patriarchy.
Okay, and that is we're gonna leave it for today. Very interesting. I think it is important to really consider how language and social structures, how norms and religious practices have all been built. I mean, they haven't only been built around this idea that women are inferior and men should rule. They also normalized owner-slave relations. They normalized in-group, out-group discrimination. And so, I mean, it's just generally, you can look just, like with a critical lens at a lot of these existing or inherited power structures. But yeah, I think this is, it is part of the story of how we got to be where we are. So Corey says, that's a lot of words to say. When people are regarded as property, they are abused. Yes, you're much more succinct than me. All right, well, that's it. I mean, like I said, I'm trying to keep these short, focused, and I will also say before I go that I'm currently sketching out a little video in my mind. I want to keep it to about 5 minutes, but I want to tell the story of this article. I don't know how much I'm going to get into the hypotheses, but I'm thinking first section is going to be like theory of evolution and the conflicting interests of biological, like reproduction, right? I want to divorce this idea of gender identity from biological functions. And so in terms of reproductive functions, and then look at the apes and do the basically most different systems design. Her interests are male coercion and female resist or female cohesion or group cohesion, and look at the various outcomes of that, and then probably do the hypotheses and then do some sort of wrap up. So we'll see if I actually get around to doing that, because like sometimes I have ideas, but I don't have time. But I will have time for you next week. We'll be back. I don't know if it's going to be Saturday or Sunday. It will depend on my energy levels because I have a lot of other things going on. But until then, I appreciate your time and attention. Hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for stopping by and writing in the chat. And until next time, I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Have a great day wherever it is and whenever it is you are. Bye.